Thank you. Hi, I'm Mackenzie, and I'll be presenting our work on ScrapMap today. So if you participate in crafting of any kind, you likely are very familiar with having a lot of leftover materials. And people who make quilts in particular tend to have a lot of scraps just lying around everywhere. And whether you have just this big pile of scraps in the corner, or you have this nice kind of orderly collection, you often end up with all these different types of colors and shapes, and it can be hard to know what to do with all of them. So one potential use of scraps is making a scrap quilt. And scrap quilting expert Judy Martin calls scrap quilts the most quilt-like and best loved of quilts. And scrap quilts come in many different styles and colors, and they're generally designed hierarchically. So while we see the full finished quilt in the end, it was likely built up from motifs, which are made up from blocks, which are made up of individual patches. And a lot of the design really starts at this block level, and it involves taking this traditional named block, like this bear paw, and this block kind of describes the geometry and sometimes certain aspects of the colors associated with each patch in the block. Now, if you were going to make a traditional kind of non-scrappy quilt, you'd go out and buy a lot of new fabric, such as this yellow and this orange, and you'd do this to kind of preserve the lighter and darker parts of the original design. But if we wanted to make a scrappy version of this, we'd have lots of smaller pieces of fabric to use and not necessarily enough of any one for our design. So if we want to apply this kind of larger number of fabrics to the different parts of the block, we still have to figure out how to preserve some of the key design elements, like the lighter and darker regions. So scrap quilts may appear, well, somewhat scrappy in appearance, but generally the design is not really just random. For example, you wouldn't have two patches of the same color next to each other. And there's some preferences that scrap quilters tend to have when it comes to designing one of these quilts. So for example, they might want to match certain colors in different places, like yellow and purple, or they might want to preserve the lighter and darker areas. And we can just think of these as kinds of constraints or guidelines for making a nice quilt in the end. So even just designing at this block level creates this very large search problem, right? The space of possibilities is really, really big when you consider all of the possible places that each scrap could go. So in this work, we therefore sought to provide users with high-quality suggestions based on a choice of their parameters. So these parameters can include things like the particular colors they have in their stash, the block geometry that they like, and then objectives like maximizing contrast or matching a target set of colors. They can also control things like how many colors they want to use in the end, and which types of color metrics they want to use. And then we use that to generate block coloring suggestions. So our key insight in generating these high-quality suggestions is to treat scrap quilting design as a constrained optimization problem. And our task is to assign different colors to different faces in the block. So we construct a constrained optimization problem where we optimize over a set of chosen scrapped objectives, in this case, contrast. And then we adhere to a number of scrap constraints, such as here using this set of 9 available fabrics, adhering to graph coloring so that we don't have neighboring pieces of the same color, applying a color difference metric of the hue, and in this case, setting a scrappiness value of 3 to set the number of colors we'll use. And in practice, we encode each optimization problem as a satisfiability modulo theory, and then use an off-the-shelf solver, in this case, Z3, which then corresponds to giving us our block coloring suggestions. So we present these coloring suggestions to the user and allow for exploration in our ScrapMap UI. And in this interactive tool, users can explore potential designs given their available set of scraps. So on the left, you'll see a gallery of traditional quilt block designs, and this is just a database we put together based on common blocks, but you could upload your own. Next to that is our block panel and our available fabric swatches. And then we also have automatic block coloring controls, the motif panel, and our quilt panel to design our quilt. So we'll start by cataloging our available fabrics we have. I added 15 fabrics earlier, and I'm just entering my last scrap here. I enter its color and its dimensions. And then I'll select the block geometry that I want to use. I happen to like these star blocks, but I want something that will create more kinds of secondary effects when I tile them together in my quilt. So I choose this yellow and green one. I then want to choose an objective that will give me the maximum difference in color between neighboring pieces. So I'll click Generate, and I'll see in this first set of results that the yellow piece in the block is really different than its blue neighbors. And these solutions, though, we notice it's high drama, but it's not particularly scrappy, since it only uses a few different fabrics. So I'll increase my scrappiness value to 6, and we'll see that there's now twice as many fabrics used in each block. But I want to see if I can go even scrappier. So I'll increase my scrappiness to 10 and generate again. So now we see that we have more fabrics in our block, and I happen to just really like these first two suggestions, so I'll save them and then see what they look like in my motif. And while this design is fairly dramatic, it does look quite different than the original block did. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the colorings from the motif, but keep them around for later in case I want to go back. So now I'm going to try a different objective, and that will be to match the target value. And my goal is to better replicate what the original block looked like. So although these suggested fabrics are kind of different in color than the original, we'll notice that the value differences are actually quite similar. So this is our automatic coloring in grayscale, and we can compare that to the original design in grayscale and see that they're very similar. And now this is just a personal preference here, but I happen to like pink, so I'm going to make all of the diagonal squares pink, and so I'm going to manually color those faces and then save this design. I can then add my block to the motif, and then explore some different rotations of the block within the motif. So for this particular design, I happen to like the alternating one best, and I'm pretty happy with it, so I want to go ahead and sew it. So I'll check if I have enough fabric automatically. It turns out that there is. But I'm curious, though, if I could make a larger quilt now with my scraps. So I'll increase the columns and rows in the quilt grid to add some additional blocks. When I check the fabric amounts again, though, at this point, it turns out that I don't have enough fabrics to do this. So in this case, I'll just decide to go back and work with fewer blocks. I can then view the fabric layout, and we'll see that it looks like I'm going to use most of my orange fabric. So I know I'll need to cut really carefully, and it's nice I have these layout guides that show me exactly how to cut. I can then download this cutting layout and cut my fabrics and sew my quilt. So for our user study, we recruited 5 participants to use ScrapMap, and I wanted to show you a couple of the designs that they made. So we had all users work with this particular color palette and this old windmill block. And you'll notice that each of them ended up choosing to use a combination of different coloring suggestions. We also provided this darker color palette and this flock of geese block. And we see that even with the same color palette, users went in very different directions and created very different visual results. We also allowed for some more open-ended exploration, and for example, we had a user choose this bear paw block, and they manually colored it with 2 of their favorite colors from their own stash. When they tried to create a full quilt with these colors, they realized they didn't have enough fabric. And so they decided to try to swap out one of the fabrics, the bigger orange square, for a different shade of orange. And this did actually solve their lack of fabric problem, but they decided their design was a little boring and wanted more variety. So they tried using ScrapMap to maximize the contrast with a scrappiness value of 3, and you see it gave them very different colors, but this kind of gave them new ideas. So they tried alternating these 2 blocks in different motif patterns. This is an example of them combining an automatic solution with the manual one they had started with. And they actually found that they liked these stronger colors, and they wanted to go even more bold. So they increased scrappiness and ended up with this design with a lot of purple in it. And so although it was actually quite far from their original design choices, they actually found that they really liked it and then started exploring different motifs from there. And ultimately ended up with this final design. And so this just shows kind of an example of combining some of these automatic coloring solutions with some of the manual input to imagine several possible designs for a given set of scraps. We also created some additional examples ourselves that we sewed, and happy to show you afterwards. And we started with this simple square and a square block, and this modern quarter log cabin, and even a custom design for the conference. So we found that ScrapMap helped users explore different possibilities for their fabrics in their scrap piles. Users specifically mentioned the helpfulness of the coloring suggestions and the cutting layout assistance, and honestly just simply seeing that they could do something with their leftover fabrics. And the objectives and constraints that we described for scrap quilting, like maximizing contrast and only using available materials, are certainly not unique to quilting. And we could imagine lots of other domains where this type of optimization approach could be used. And we think that there are many opportunities for future work at the intersection of design and optimization and creative material reuse. And we hope that this and future tools can help people creatively reuse their leftover materials and combine some of their personal stylistic preferences with these more automatic suggestions. With that, thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Hi, Ari Blankhorn, Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. This is wonderful. I want to hear a little bit more about the cutting layout guide because, as I'm sure you know, most quilters don't cut out every single triangle individually and then sew them together. So does this do any optimization for more effective piecing?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we use like a rectangle packing algorithm, and so we do try to do our best to align it in the corner and actually create strips of the same width. So you could imagine when quilters cut, they often cut kind of long strips of fabric and then cut off pieces from there. And so our packing algorithm that we use does incorporate some of that and try to line things up that way. We also just notice that in practice, you'll see a lot of the designs are squares and rectangles and right triangles, and so we try to leverage that a bit as well to make it reasonable to sew from and not be totally crazy and just cut pieces all over. So, yeah, thank you.
Hi, that was a great talk. I'm Katie Ulinsky from Carnegie Mellon. A lot of the crafters that I know aren't particularly interested in technology, or they might have like low technology literacy. How are you handling learnability for the system to kind of meet these types of users where they are?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it speaks to a lot of these other things beyond just individual tools and reactions people have to any type of new tool or to in any types of these studies or broader deployments. I think that it's definitely something you see a lot in quilting, and you see people that come to the table definitely that are they want to step away from computers, or they don't like using computers, and that's why they sew. And so I think we try to think about those things in terms of right, there's certain aspects of this that aren't automated. Most of the fabric is still cut by hand. People sew by hand, and respecting the fact that certain parts of this process are going to be manual. People can manually select where scraps go. In a lot of cases, scraps are like sentimental, or certain parts of fabrics are sentimental. And so I think in system design, there's a lot of making sure that people can have that choice over where some of these decisions are made and so forth. And then, yeah, in terms of actually working with quilters and so forth, yeah, understanding that some folks are going to try it and just decide that they have their own process, they have their own non-computational way of doing it, and that's okay. I'll say in practice, a lot of quilters are very exploratory and open to new tools and really want to try things. But I think there's a lot of open questions and how to think about that in the longer term. Not just in an individual trial, but when the tools are out there. But it's a really good, deep question. Thank you.
Thank you.